Hey everyone, this is Alan Schivel, DevOps.com, MediaOps, Security Boulevard, Container Journal. Welcome to our video community discussion on software composition analysis, or SCA. Not familiar with SCA, you say? Don't worry, you will be at the end of this conversation. But before we start, I'm really happy that we have a truly all-star panel made up of some of the leaders in the software composition analysis field, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. First to my right, Derek Weeks. Derek, go ahead.
Hi, Alan. Thanks for inviting us. Always good to see you. So I'm Derek Weeks. I'm Vice President and DevOps Advocate at Sonatype. I've been with the company for 5.5 years now. I'm the lead author around the State of the Software Supply Chain report and our DevSecOps community survey, and also a co-founder of All Day DevOps.
Fantastic. Thanks, Derek. Next to Derek in your gallery view is David Habusha of WhiteSource. David, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, Alan. Thanks for inviting me and happy to be here. David Habusha, VP of Product with WhiteSource. I've been with the company for 2 years and happy to discuss SCA with my colleagues.
Fantastic. And these truly are colleagues. We don't usually see this kind of mix. And then, David, thanks for being with us. And then last but certainly not least, we have Patrick Carey from Synopsys, Black Duck. Folks, Patrick, welcome.
Hi, Alan, and thank you for inviting me. Yes, my name is Patrick Carey. I am head of product marketing for Synopsys, formerly head of product marketing for Black Duck, which I joined back in 2015. And I and my team are responsible for the marketing of Black Duck and the production of our open source security and risk analysis report.
Fantastic, and thanks for joining us, Patrick. So, guys, what brings us together today, as I mentioned before, was software composition analysis, or SCA. What and kind of the catalyst is this morning we saw the release. Well, I think it's the first, the Forrester Wave. It's the first wave on software composition analysis for Q2 2019. And I'm hoping at this point, all three of you have had a chance to take a look at it.
Yep.
Yep, good. So, let's start off at the general level and talk about software composition analysis. I am thrilled, frankly, that finally the one of the larger analyst firms, the industry as a whole, has given a name to what it is you guys really excel at, and more importantly, has recognized the fact that most of today's applications and software are made up of components, largely made up of components, and those components are largely open source. So in some ways, it's got to be a sweet validation for all three of you. Interested in your take, Derek?
Yeah, well, certainly when I got into Sonatype, and perhaps when Patrick got into Black Duck, the market wasn't big enough for analysts to cover it. So you're right. Seeing Forrester, seeing Gartner, 451, and others cover component analysis and actually cover it within kind of how they categorize markets, I think is an important validation for this. Software composition analysis has gotten a lot of headlines over the past couple of years since the Equifax breach. But I think, like you said, it's really driven by what our customers are doing in their development teams using open source components across their development lifecycle, whether that's open source components or containers. And the more that they use those, the more that they're concerned about the quality and attributes of those. So I think this just, it's a reflection of what's happening in the market. Analysts don't necessarily create markets. They just report on markets as they happen. And I think we've all done a good job at elevating the attention of this market and, certainly at Sonatype serving our customers in the process.
Absolutely. David, any thoughts on any attention to, PR, good or bad, is still PR. Any attention here, no matter how you do in the wave, is a good thing rising tide will lift all boats.
Yeah, and much agreed. I much agree with Derek. Looking at the sheer growth of the open source usage in the industry in the last few years, and it's pretty much everywhere. Even in financial institutes, we see governments using open source, and the growth in the number of security vulnerabilities associated with open source and the compliance issues associated with open source as well is definitely generates a room or a whole market that needs to be covered by analysts. And we're very happy to have Forrester covering this market. And looking at the way modern customers actually accommodate with the use of open source, looking at things like automation, remediation, reporting, policies is the right way to cover these types of solutions today.
Excellent. Patrick, rather than repeating what the other two said, I can't imagine you disagreeing. But you know what? Synopsys has been a player here for some time. And then, of course, with the Black Duck acquisition, really kind of, fortified, no pun intended, fortified those, your credentials and your capabilities. There's more to it, of course, than open source, though, yeah?
Oh, absolutely. And, Synopsys acquired Black Duck a little over a year ago now. And with a recognition that open source was, in modern application could constitute, as Forrester cites, up to 90% of the code base in a modern application. But certainly we see now a much broader perspective where customers are looking at open source vulnerabilities in particular in conjunction with vulnerabilities introduced through proprietary code or even through the way the application is configured and deployed. And we think the analysts are starting to recognize that as well and see software composition analysis as being a first-class citizen in the application security toolkit. And we're very happy to see them recognizing what we already saw in the market.
I agree. Let me put my old guy hat on here a second, right? I remember launching, when I helped found Still Secure, a product called VAM in 2002, which was a vulnerability access management. And it was all vulnerability management. And then we sort of saw the cleaving of vulnerability management and penetration testing with things like Metasploit and stuff like that, right? And then when White Hat Security came out, Jeremiah Grossman launched it all those years ago. And we really kind of saw for the first time, SaaS-based AppSec scanning, if you will. But, and then over the years now we've seen DAST and static and dynamic and everything else. And it always was sort of nipping at the edges of this reality, which is software today is component-based, right? It's very much, Derek, as I've seen you talk about, the assembly line, not very different in some ways from an automobile assembly line where we have third-party parts that get assembled into your car. So it is I think a high water, hopefully not a high water mark, but certainly a day to remember where we see a wave on SCA. But guys, beyond just scanning okay, so now we'll scan open source components and tell you it's old, it's vulnerable, you need to update it, what have you. So is that what we're looking at, is just another scanner? Or where are the value adds to these scanners, if you will? And I don't even know if scanning is the right word, but the value add beyond just scanning. Yeah, Patrick, why don't we let you go first? You went last time.
Sure. So I think what we see happening at the same time that it's hard to say that open source is growing anymore. It's grown, but this whole movement towards adoption of more automated development and deployment capabilities, DevOps, and the so-called shift left movement one of the challenges with more of a legacy approach to application security testing is it was very reactionary. It came at the end of the process, and just at the rate that software is being developed today, teams have recognized that they need to move that detection and prevention of vulnerabilities way to the left, even to the developer desktop. So where we see kind of the frontier for this is in three areas. One is in integration with the other development tools that teams are using, so IDEs, CI tools, repos, the automation of policies. So rather than going to an open source governance board, you essentially set the ground rules up front, and you allow the automation systems to enforce those. And the enabling of the developer to make the right decisions up front. That's the cheapest time to remediate is before vulnerable code even enters your code base. And so the confluence of those three things and helping sort of thin out a sea of vulnerabilities down to what are the ones you need to focus on are really where SCA is heading in the upcoming years.
Interesting. David, comments, thoughts to that?
Yeah, again, much agreed. I believe that first, open source or software composition analysis is not just another scanner. It's a way to approach modern software development lifecycle. And as Patrick mentioned, shifting left these efforts is a key to success. And it's being able to automatically put the security and quality gates as left as possible, but it's also how do you prioritize the right vulnerabilities to look at to actually make it a manageable process from the engineering side and help the relationships between the DevOps and security teams and the engineering teams by first allowing developers to use their own natural environments, integrating into IDEs and repos, as Patrick mentioned, and also giving them much less vulnerabilities to examine to make it a more streamlined process and to help the cooperation. Now, it's not only that, because you can also automate the remediation, not just the scanning. So with open source, there's a lot of tools because you're integrated into the pipeline to actually automate the remediation and sometimes even by a single click, update to the latest non-vulnerable component or apply different techniques that you cannot do actually with SAST or DAST tools because you need to go through the whole process again. So open source actually creates for the first time not just the one time or periodic scanning, but a continuous environment where you can scan and fix vulnerabilities automatically and put these security gates automatically so you can maintain a clean and secure software easily.
Actually, I don't disagree. Derek, thoughts?
Yeah, you mentioned, is it just another scanner? I think scanning is really just one part of it, and I think David and Patrick have talked about different aspects of that. But I think getting back to what you were saying, Alan, about this is basically representative of the use of open source is representative of software being akin to modern manufacturing. You're using parts. And if you're a development team, what you want to understand is I'm using the latest parts, I'm using the best versions of those parts, I'm using the best part within a category of hundreds or thousands of open source parts that are similar in the market. I'm using the right licenses. And I think it's really about taking information about what those best attributes are of any part your development organization is and automating the governance of those so that you have guardrails for your developers throughout their development lifecycle. And for years I've reported on the state of the software supply chain. Why this is really coming to bear isn't just because we can do it and we have this capability, but organizations are seeing our developers are downloading 500,000 open source components into our development lifecycle each year. In some cases, millions. I've seen as high as 16 or 17 million open source components consumed annually. And when you're using all of these parts within a development practice, you can't just say, hey, all parts are created equal. You have to understand some have known vulnerabilities. You might be using 27 or 55 different versions of a part. Well, why don't you actually streamline your manufacturing and use the best version or the best couple of versions of that, rather than having 55 different versions across your organization that your developers are trying to use or trying to integrate continuously. So it's really about, how do we increase the velocity of the manufacturing process while keeping quality at the highest standard.
But nevertheless, guys, we could say it's not a scanner, and I get that it's not a scanner. But some of the same issues that we had with scanning and vulnerabilities kind of rear their head here, right? And to give the Forrester folks their due, they called out some of these in the report. Things like speed of scanning versus false positives, right? Scalability of scanning. And then here's a really important, not that the other two aren't important, but another really important thing is the ability to do something, actionable intelligence, I call it, right? All right, you scan something and you've got a vulnerable open source component. How do I go about updating that? And that's really important as we talked about shifting left and throwing this onto developers and so forth, right? How do we fix that? And it's a problem. It's a problem. Derek, I thought we lost you there for a second. I'll tap you back. Patrick, what do you think, Patrick?
Well, if you look at where SCA evolved from, so when Black Duck really got into this back in 2004 when the company was founded, the main problem was teams wanted to find every bit of open source in the code base to make sure that they weren't violating
licenses.
Right. And so the bias was towards identifying every single piece of open source just to eliminate that risk. Now, flash forward 15 years and open source use has exploded. So now we have teams that have the opposite problem, where the amount of open source vulnerabilities that are surfaced are too many to take care of all of them. So they want help in prioritizing and reducing the time to remediation. And unfortunately, the gold standard for the longest time has been the National Vulnerability Database, and it's still probably the single most common resource that teams use. But if you look at the records in the NVD, for developers, it's really sort of hit and miss. The records may not be completed in a timely manner relative to when the vulnerability is disclosed. And even then, the guidance in there could be fairly cryptic. And so this is another area where products like ours and the others on this panel are working on, is to enhance the vulnerability data that is in the NVD to help identify optimal paths to remediation, whether that's which component to upgrade to, evidence of attack or evidence of compromise, things that help teams prioritize and shorten that race that they're in between when a vulnerability is publicly disclosed and when they find it and fix it in their code base.
Fair enough. David, false positive, speed of scanning, how important is that to a white hat?
White source. And
white
it's very
source.
Important. Yeah.
I apologize.
It's very important. I just want to touch on one point, again, bringing back the discussion of having a mere kind of just a scanner. So open source is different from proprietary code in the sense that even if you scan the code and nothing has changed, a new vulnerability may affect your existing applications. And with open source, the detection is very accurate because the open source components are uniquely identified. So you are able to alert and remediate on new vulnerabilities that affect existing applications. So that's something that just a scanner doesn't cover. Now, when it comes to false positives and the scalability of scans, we're talking about customers today who may run thousands of builds per day, and you need to scan your code with every build. So you have to have a system in place that quickly scans. They don't go beyond like 2 or 3 minutes scan time, because otherwise they'll break the CI/CD processes or the build time. You have to have a very accurate set of results with little false positives as possible. But with open source, you can actually be 100% correct, because these are known open source components. And then you have to adapt into these into this type of velocity, into these types of loads when running so many builds a day. So this is very important in the modern environment, where you want to fit in to the modern software development lifecycle, being able to scan hundreds or thousands of times a day and reporting only on the things that have changed and really matter with regards to vulnerabilities, license, and quality.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Derek, you know, in the Wave report, actually, Sonatype was cited for having low false positives, and commendable. You know, how important, how much weight should that have? I'm going to assume you're going to say a lot, but you know, well, seriously, how important is that?
You know, the thing that we've been focused on ever since we've been in business is what do our customers need? And what they need is accurate, actionable information. And you know, to kind of bring it to light, I'm sitting with a customer at Broadridge Financial a couple of weeks ago, and they had an internal DevOps day, and the development team is sitting around talking about different security practices that they have. And one of these is that they have a static analysis tool within their environment. And the developers are going, man, like, we're using this and it's delivering all this information and it's noise. Like, I'm getting pages and pages of information from the static analysis tool. How do I act upon it? And I said, you know, quite honestly, you guys are a development team. You're using a tool that was built for security teams. And that's never going to give you the kind of answer that you need. You know, fast information, accurate information with low noise, actionable information, so that you know if this thing is bad, what's the good thing and how quickly can I move to it, right? So it's not, you know, when you say scanning, I think it gets an adverse reaction from us, because that kind of positions this as, yeah, this is another security tool and another security chain. But this is really about your developers are using something. And you want to know, as a developer, am I using the best parts or the worst parts, right? And yes, security plays a role in what the best or worst attributes are, but they're just one party at the table. And I think if you're a developer, you want information that's coming at you that you can say, if I'm going to work on this, it better be a problem. I don't want a false alarm coming up that lends me down a path that says, look, I have a 2-week sprint that I need to finish, or we're doing commits continuously throughout the day. So it is important for the customers that we have, and I'm sure everyone here, that the outcomes that you're really getting at is, I have feedback loops that are quick, I have feedback loops in my DevOps pipeline that are actionable, and I'm not sent on a wild goose chase going down chasing false positives, you know, that are just a waste of my time, right? I think security people in AppSec tool land, you know, they're used to, like, show me everything that's, you know, wrong with this or potentially wrong with this, and I'm fine if you give me 12 pages of report of what's going on. If you're a developer, that's the last thing that you want. You want to know there are 2 things really wrong with this, and by the way, they're wrong, and here's, you know, the right thing that you can do immediately, and to surface that as quickly as possible. And in some cases, if you can automate the remediation of that, even better for the developer.
Sure. So David, it brings up, you know, Derek's point is valid. It brings up an interesting situation. Who is your customer, the developer or the security team, or both? And if it's both, can you serve 2 masters?
Yeah, that's a really important point. And our customers are both, and you have to cater both the security teams. From a management perspective, you have to give them the tools and dashboards and decision-making systems and policy enforcement and reporting. While to actually cooperate with the development teams, you have to provide the developers with tools that integrate into their normal day-to-day development environment that, as Derek mentioned, only focus on what matters, on the very few vulnerabilities that make the difference, the high severity ones, the ones that actually impact your applications, that will be called from your app, and then you have to integrate into their IDEs, into their repositories, and give them the actionable information about the essence of the vulnerability, how to fix it, and also the automated tools to actually fix them as soon as possible, so they'll be able to build the software again and to ship it free of security vulnerabilities for the next version of the software. And the friction today, and I know that it's something that is kind of repeating between the security teams and the development teams, as Derek mentioned, developers don't really like resolving security issues. So you'll be better off giving them just a small number of vulnerabilities that really matter in their own environment, in their own tools, so they'll cooperate and they'll resolve that as quickly as possible. So they are our users as well, but in the sense of the tools that need to cater to the developer community, these are different tools. These are more integrated tools into their environment. So security team sets the policies, the reporting, they look at trends, and they'll be able to report to their management, while the development team actually resolve the issues in their own natural environment.
Excellent. Patrick, I know what the history of Black Duck, and look, I remember in 2004, Phil Odens was still is a good friend of mine, right? Open source licensing was kind of the reason for being. Well, with the, merging into Synopsys, obviously, you have a much bigger history and heritage of working security. How do you guys kind of balance, serving both constituencies?
Well, yeah, and really for SCA, arguably there's three constituencies, right? Because as you point out, back when software composition analysis was primarily about license compliance, it was sort of a legal team, development team partnership. And so I think from a security and development team standpoint, the organizations that we work with, we see a consistent acknowledgement that often the push to add more security tools into the environment, it may be driven by security, but security teams have recognized that they are now working in partnership with the development team, that they can't actually be successful in deploying security tools today and having them work effectively if they're not the tools that the developers will use. And so in many ways, SCA has been farther ahead in this capability for some time, because it inherently was viewed more by developers as a tool that helped them select better components, identify if the components were poorer quality. It sort of naturally fits in various stages of the SDLC, all the way from component selection at the developer desktop through automated policy enforcement through CI processes. And as I think was mentioned previously, unlike a scanner, it's relevant at the operations time frame, right? An Equifax breach, that wasn't a failure during the development cycle. That vulnerability hadn't been discovered when the developers were writing that code and when it shipped. It was presumed secure. It was only after that code was in production that vulnerability was disclosed. And so, for us, we see it's this natural evolution that I think all of the security tools are moving towards. So static analysis is moving much more into the desktop. And so the modern updates to SAST are really focused on IDEs. DAST is morphing into interactive application security testing, something that can be automated through the CI process. And so for us, it doesn't feel like so much of a contention, so much as a natural evolution that we're obviously working to try and support.
Sure. So guys, one more question I want to, and then we'll jump into the Wave findings, because we should mention it as long as it's come out. But first I want to discuss what I call the Equifax Paradox, which is, and Derek, I think I learned this from your report last year at one of our DevSecOps days, which is, we all know Equifax with struts to the vulnerable open source component. But yet when we looked at the downloads of open source components after the Equifax breach, after we tell people, hey, struts 2, this component was vulnerable, this is how it got in, update, get rid of, stop using vulnerable, forget the millions of other open source vulnerable components they're using. They're still using vulnerable versions of struts 2. They're still downloading it slightly less than they did before the thing, but not too much less. Am I, Derek, if I'm lying, I'm dying, but am I telling the truth? I mean, look at the numbers.
Yeah, I think it's actually ticked up a little more, that downloads of vulnerable versions of struts are up since the Equifax breach. I think the last report I saw from our Maven Central repository is that we're at something like 130,000 downloads a month across almost 9,000 organizations. I think a couple of things come to light here. One is, people mention Equifax, and while we love them as a customer, they weren't the only struts breach that happened. On the same days that Equifax was breached, we had the GMO payment gateway in Japan. We had Canada Revenue. We had Canada Statistics. We had the Japan Post, India Post. We had India's Social Security system. They were all struts breaches within days or months after. So Equifax was not the only one using a vulnerable version of struts. But I think it kind of gets to the point of what we were mentioning earlier about, look, developers are using open source components in massive, massive quantities for any organization out there. And I think that in the case of Equifax, as Patrick mentioned, it was safe when they were starting to use it. It became vulnerable over time. And when that happens, when a new vulnerability happens, you have to ask yourself 2 questions. Did I ever use that component? And if I did, where is it? So when OpenSSL, and Heartbleed happened, when struts happened, when Bash and Poodle and all these other things happened, you need to answer those questions quickly. And if you can't, if you don't understand what you've used and where it is, it's nearly impossible to remediate it in a timely fashion. And we've seen that, it used to be the time between a vulnerability being disclosed and the exploits appearing in the wild was 45 days a decade ago. In most cases, it's around 24 to 72 hours now before exploits are appearing in the wild. And in some cases, the exploits are being built into the open source projects by adversaries and shipped out. We just saw this last week with Bootstrap SaaS. Someone created a version of that open source project that had a backdoor in it, put it in the Ruby Gems repository, and people started to download this. I think they had 1,400 downloads or something from a project that has 28 million downloads. So there are adversaries out there impacting the validity of the software supply chains out there. And so if you don't, as much as we can scan and remediate and integrate into developer tools, if someone's out there saying, gosh, I need to get started, like, what do I need to do? If you can't identify what you've used and where that is in production or in development, you can't start to do any of the other stuff, right?
And you know what? That's back to Patrick's point about the initial, Black Duck push, which was, let's just identify what open source you have, and whether you use, then decide what your license compliances are, or whether or not they're vulnerable is another story. David, what can we do, David? Is automatic remediation the answer, right? Automated remediation. I see an outdated struts, I replace it automatically. Is that the answer? Will people go for that? What do you think?
I think that's a key to successful security hygiene of modern apps. But I think that it also relies on the maturity level of processes in the different organizations. If they care about enforcing compliance as early as possible in the process, if they break builds in case of a security vulnerability, and usually they don't do that because again, relationships between developers and security teams, so they just alert on the vulnerability and they don't really break that. Or if they find a new vulnerability, they generate an automated pull request, for example, that enforce the developer to take an immediate action, then yes, automated remediations may resolve these issues, but customers need to acknowledge that the risk of automatically updating components with regards to backward compatibility and automated testing is still, it's still better to do that than to take the risk of being in the attack window where the vulnerability has been disclosed, but you don't have any remediation yet. So yes, you should automatically remediate your vulnerabilities. Try to do it as early as possible in the process. And depending on the maturity level, try to enforce compliance as early as possible. And in the operational aspect, when a new vulnerability is discovered, and as my colleagues mentioned, you know which applications are affected, and you may end up doing that on the container level, you may end up doing that on the server or VM level, then take the immediate remediation advice, test your application, roll it up to production as soon as possible.
Fair enough. So, guys, I know we're over time, but I think this was an important discussion to have. Let's quickly kind of talk about the Forrester Wave finding results. And before we do that, I want to relate a story, my own personal experience. Back in my Still Secure days, Gartner used to put out the Magic Quadrant. I want to say it was for intrusion detection or intrusion prevention at the time. And I remember being in a meeting with it was the Navy Marine Corps Internet, NMCI. And I got into a bit of a heated discussion with a Marine. No surprise there. And, his analysis was that with the Gartner Magic Quadrant, all that mattered was the top upper right quadrant. That if you were in the challenges or the up-and-comers or whatever, if you were in any of the other quadrants, you were no good. And it was only the top upper right and only the one in the upper right that such a proud institution as the United States Marines would be associated with. And, I had to explain to him that that's not even what Gartner says. So when we look at the Forrester Wave, findings here, we should absolutely, take that with a grain of salt. So that being said, though, I'm going to put up here right now, I'm assuming you guys can see, and again, a picture is not worth 1,000 words at this point, because you really, and I encourage everyone listening and watching this, go read the full report. I think it's publicly available today, because they have, caveats and all kinds of footnotes in with each of the companies on here. And no matter where a company shows up on this Wave report that you're looking, there are strengths and weaknesses to each of them. But obviously, congratulations to White Source Synopsys in the leaders track or Wave section. Derek, you guys are clearly strong performers. And also, when you look at the size of the circle, it's how big you are or what your presence in market is. So congratulations to that. But I'm going to ask each of you to kind of, and again, not here to badmouth Forrester or anybody else, but how do you relate or what do you attribute the findings here in the wave? And I'm going to give you each a chance to agree or disagree with some of the findings here that Forrester has put up.
Yeah, so I'll go first. So one, we're happy to be in the Final Four. I think with the NCAA tournament going on right now, Final Four is a pretty good position.
Yep.
And the other thing, I think Amy DeMartine, who led this at Forrester, I think did a good job at figuring out what attributes were important to the market, understanding what we were doing at Sonatype, and the commenting on the very low positives, the remediation guidance, the integration into DevSecOps pipelines or into developer pipelines, which in our case are a lot of DevSecOps pipelines. I think it's an important evaluation of the market. I think she got the top 4 right here. Sorry, my auto lights here on the in the conference room just went off. But I think the key thing to remember is at Forrester, Amy is an AppSec analyst. She's not a DevOps analyst. And I think that when you talk to the DevOps analyst at Forrester, that one helped us create the total economic impact report, talking to 4 of our customers, seeing a 325% ROI over 3 years using our products, getting a payback in under 3 months. I think when you talk to DevOps analysts out there, as well as AppSec analysts out there, I think you get varied positions. So if you're an AppSec person following AppSec news, then the findings in this report may be more weighted to you. I think if you're a DevOps analyst or covering DevSecOps, then you're going to have a different view of the market. But I think the kind of key attributes that are discussed are some of the right ones to discuss in the market.
Derek, I couldn't agree more. And it's funny, in a firm like Forrester, where they do have DevOps analysts. I've spoken to them many times. So
yeah, we speak to them all the time.
Yeah, that they wouldn't have put them in there. But Patrick, we'll work our way up. How about you?
Well, we generally think that this wave process is a very good way to analyze the vendor space, and I think people who download and read the report, Amy puts in a lot of thoughtful commentary on each of the vendors on what their relative strengths and weaknesses are, and the tool that they provide to allow teams to weight the different scores based on their priorities, I think is really useful and a novel approach. Amy, although she's an AppSec analyst, certainly is tuned into the needs of DevOps and automated development. And I think you see some of that reflected here also in terms of the acknowledgement of the necessity to automate these processes and integrate them with the development lifecycle. Interestingly, the 3 of us here on this panel, Sonatype, Synopsys, and WhiteSource, although we overlap here in the space of SCA, our overall organizational focuses are somewhat different. Synopsys is a full spectrum application security vendor, as you point out. So we're looking at everything from static analysis to SCA to DAST and professional services. And so, our strengths tend to be more in the integration across those different realms and the integrations for us. Sonatype has a slightly different focus and works more in the pure DevOps space, and then WhiteSource obviously is focused on SCA. So I think it's interesting, to see that mix of vendors here and the different vendor focuses reflected here in this top 4.
Interesting. David, how about you?
Well, it's been a very interesting process to walk through this report, and we're happy that the criteria that led to the scoring of the report that is based on the actual principles that we just discussed, which are enforcing compliance, remediating security issues, generating the right reports on time, and also catering to the both management and security personas, as well as the DevOps and the development teams, and providing the right tools to close the loop in that regard, starting from selecting the right components and then putting the right security gates, enforcing the policies and compliance. But more importantly, as a key to achieving the right SCA strategy is how you prioritize security vulnerabilities. So we're very happy to be acknowledged as the vendor that actually provides the best tools to support all these use cases and cater the different personas. And as my colleagues mentioned, we are a pure player in this market, and definitely being where we are and providing these types of tools and catering to these people probably generated these results, and we're happy for that. I think that if you read the detailed comparison and look at the strategy and the various components that led to it, you'll see the actual tools and services and processes that actually led to providing these types of results. And again, we're happy for that.
Excellent. Guys, I'm going to stop sharing this now. We're way over the time that I had asked you to donate or participate in this. I apologize. We'll wrap it up with this. I'd like to give each of you a chance to kind of state your last sort of statements to leave with our listeners and viewers. Why don't we start? Patrick, you went last to start, so why don't you go first, then we'll go to David and then to Derek.
Okay, great. And thank you again for pulling together this panel. I think this has been an interesting discussion. So, we here at Synopsys have been focused for a long time on helping teams build secure, high-quality software and building it faster. And I think one of the key takeaways from this is that the acknowledgement that SCA is now really a critical component for any application development team, any application development process, any application development tool chain. And so I give credit to Forrester to shining a light on this and helping teams, security and development, understand some of what they need to be looking for in vendors, and highlighting the vendors that are in the space and the good work that's happening to help teams build secure software.
Fantastic. David?
Yeah. And again, thank you for inviting us, and very interesting to be together with my colleagues talking about the SCA market. And I think the report actually reflects the trends in the market for automation, remediation, and enforcing policies. If you just look at the number of vendors in the report comparing to the 2017 report, you see that there's a lot more vendors that made it into the report. And we know that there's a lot more vendors that wanted to make it into the report, which did not make it due to certain limitations. So we see the market growing, and we see the acknowledgement in various vendors from not just the pure SCA play, but from other plays like repositories trying to get into this space. And we think that the work that has been done on this report, trying to really understand the right ingredients associated with an SCA solution, we're very kind of reflecting the market and the needs. And again, appreciate being on this panel. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Derek.
Yeah, so Alan, again, thanks for inviting us all on and talking about SCA, because as much as we're all growing our businesses, I don't think people are talking about SCA enough. If you look at how many open source components and containers are out there and how many organizations are managing those, I think we're still in the very early innings of this market. I think some of that is even visible from do you have AppSec analysts covering this space? Do you have DevOps analysts covering this space? Do you have DevSecOps analysts covering this space? I think that analyst firms are still trying to figure out which silos this fits in, or if they need to merge their own silos. I think that will continue to evolve over time. But I think we're really happy with where things are because at a business like Sonatype, I've been here 5.5 years. We've been growing 60, 70% every year I've been at the company. We have a huge number of Fortune 2000 clients, including Equifax and Salesforce and all these. And I think that if people aren't paying attention to the open source components that they're using, they need to start looking at what they're using and start evaluating solutions that can help them deliver higher quality code faster, and include the development teams, the DevOps teams, the security teams, the architecture teams, the legal teams, into a solution that really plays toward and caters toward all of them and enables them to work together in, I think, newer, higher velocity ways. And so I think if you're listening to this and you haven't looked into this space, I think the time is well overdue, and it's time for all of us to step into this and take a good look at the different vendors and different offerings out there.
Thank you, Derek. So guys, let me just wrap it up by saying that, number one, I think it's really a red letter day where we can really focus attention on SCA, and we can help educate people on what SCA is, why it's important, why they need to get with the program. Whether you buy into a wave report or have problems with how they tabulated, it's another story. I think all of us are at least glad that someone's looking at this. It's important. Secondly, really kudos to all three of you, because let's face it, you're all competitors in this space. Though, as Patrick said, you all have your own special sauce in other areas you play in. We're happy to provide sort of a neutral forum where I can gather together, people who I know in the industry, and we could discuss it in this manner. So thank you very much for participating. For folks out there listening to this, go grab the Wave Report. There is a ton of great information in there. More importantly, go look at what you're doing with open source, right? What open source components have snuck in or have made their way into, your applications, and what are you doing to monitor licensing of them, vulnerabilities of them, the security of them, the management of them. It's too important to overlook. So David, Patrick, Derek, thank you very much for your time today. Thanks to all three of your companies. Thanks to Amy DiMartino and the Forrester folks for their wave. It would have been great to get Amy on here today with us, but I just wasn't able to pull that one off. Next time. Anyway, until then, this is Alan Schemmel for DevOps.com Security Boulevard Container Journal. Thanking Derek from Sonatype, Patrick from Synopsys, David from White Source being here today. Have a great day, everyone.